Princess Elara of Aramor stood in the shadowed alcove of the grand hall, her face veiled with an expression of quiet resolve. Around her, the echoes of a celebration still lingered in the air, each note and laugh sharp as glass against her heart. Tonight was meant to be a night of joy, a union that would bring peace to her kingdom. But instead, it had become a cruel theater, where love was merely a mask worn by the man who had plotted to strip her of everything she held dear. Hours earlier, Elara had overheard Aldrich, her betrothed, the man she had dared to trust, speaking in hushed tones with his closest advisor. Their words cut through her like cold steel. Plans of conquest, promises of power, and her role as nothing more than a pawn to legitimize his rule. Every promise he had made, every gentle look, had been a part of his deception. The man she had trusted with her heart intended to claim her throne, casting her aside like a forgotten relic of the past. But Elara was no pawn. The betrayal did not shatter her. It ignited something deep within, something fierce and unyielding. Alone in the shadows, her fingers brushed the edge of the dagger at her side, the weight of her ancestors pressing down upon her. She was the last line of defense for her kingdom, and if she could not rule it with honor, she would guard it with her life. Yet, even amidst the fury and heartache, Elara knew she could not act in haste. She would play the role of dutiful bride just a little longer, let Aldrich believe she was his to control. For the sake of her people, she would become something he would never see coming, a force hidden in plain sight, the silent architect of his downfall. When the dawn broke, she would face her father, the court, and the man she once thought she might love, her heart steeled, her resolve forged. As the first light of morning poured over Aramor's towers, Elara prepared to step forward, leaving behind the girl she once was and becoming the princess her kingdom needed. She would smile, she would vow, and in her heart, she would carry the quiet promise of vengeance. The kingdom of Aramor lay bathed in the gentle light of dawn. Its towers rose proudly, casting long shadows over fields of golden wheat and sprawling forests. In the grand hall, filled with banners of deep green and gold, Princess Elara stood before her father, King Aldred, and the court, her gaze steady, her heart brimming with hope. Elara, the only daughter of the king, had known her duty from a young age. As the sole heir to the throne, her path had been paved with lessons in diplomacy, strategy, and sacrifice. She had grown up in a world of polished armor and whispered secrets, where every word she spoke carried the weight of her lineage. But today was different. Today, her future was bound to something beyond duty alone. She was to be wed to Prince Aldrich, the young heir of the neighboring kingdom of Tyrelia, an alliance forged in ink and sealed by a promise of peace. This marriage was to unite their lands and bring harmony to the fractured realms. And yet, for Elara, it was more than a mere union of crowns. It was a bridge toward something she had longed for, but rarely glimpsed: true companionship, perhaps even love. Aldrich had arrived at the castle with the dawn, his presence filling the hall with a noble air. He was tall, with piercing eyes that spoke of strength and intelligence, and a smile that seemed genuine. His manners were refined, his words laced with compliments and assurances of their bright future together. And as he took her hand in his, promising to cherish her, Elara felt her heart stir. She recalled their first meeting months ago at the Midsummer Festival, a brief encounter among courtiers and nobles, where their eyes had met across the room. There had been a glimmer of warmth in his gaze, a shared smile that held the promise of more. Since then, letters had flown between their kingdoms, each one revealing glimpses of Aldrich's wit, his intellect, and his apparent affection for her. Now, standing before her father and the court, Elara felt a flicker of hope rise within her. Aldrich's words, his gaze, even the small gestures he made, a hand at her elbow to guide her, a soft murmur meant only for her ears, all seemed to speak of a future filled with respect and mutual understanding. She dared to believe that this marriage could be more than a strategic alliance. King Aldred's voice cut through the silence, a deep rumble that filled the hall. Today, we solidify the peace that our kingdoms have long sought. Today, my daughter is to be bound in marriage to the Prince of Tyranny. Let this union mark the beginning of a new era, one free of strife and filled with prosperity for our people." As he spoke, Elara felt the eyes of the court upon her. Nobles and warriors, servants and scholars, they all watched her with varying expressions, some admiring, others envious, but all aware of the gravity of her role. She was not merely a bride. She was a symbol of unity, the embodiment of the kingdom's hopes. When Aldrich raised her hand to his lips, his eyes met hers with a warmth that seemed genuine. He spoke softly, his voice filled with a tenderness that Elara found both comforting and thrilling. "Princess Elara," he said, "I am honored to be by your side. Together, we shall forge a future worthy of our kingdoms and our people." Her heart quickened, and for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life with Aldrich. Could he be more than a political pawn? Could this man be the one who would understand her heart, her dreams, and her fears? She wanted to believe it, and in that moment she did. But in the recesses of her mind, a shadow lingered, the silent caution that had been instilled in her since childhood. A princess must be wise, wary, and unyielding, her father had told her many times. Though Aldrich's words were sweet and his gaze sincere, she could not entirely banish her wariness. Even the purest waters can conceal treacherous depths. As the court cheered and the musicians began to play, Elara and Aldrich moved to the center of the hall to share the first dance of their betrothal celebration. The music swelled, filling the vast chamber with a lively tune, and Elara felt herself swept along by the melody. She moved with grace, her gown swirling around her like silver mist, her steps light and poised. Aldrich held her, with the gentle yet firm touch of a practiced dancer, his movements as elegant as they were effortless. He smiled down at her, his eyes alight with something that resembled admiration. She could feel the gazes of the court, feel the weight of their expectations, but at that moment, it was just the two of them. She dared to return his smile, feeling the warmth of his hand on her waist, the steadiness of his presence. Yet as they turned, her gaze drifted across the hall, catching sight of her closest confidant, Lady Muriel, who watched with an expression Elara couldn't quite place. A pang of unease crept into her heart, a faint shadow cast upon the bright tapestry of her happiness. She dismissed it quickly, chiding herself for her doubts. Today was a day of celebration, of hope. She was to marry a prince who would stand by her side, who spoke of love and loyalty. The dance ended, and the hall erupted into applause. Aldrich released her hand, bowing gracefully as she curtsied, their smiles polite yet veiled with an unspoken understanding. She felt the thrill of a new beginning, the anticipation of a future yet unwritten. But as the cheers rose around her, Elara could not ignore the slight chill that whispered at the edge of her joy, a feeling as fleeting as it was unnerving. She glanced once more at Aldrich, who returned her gaze with a look that seemed almost too perfect, too polished. In the depths of her heart, a quiet voice cautioned her to tread carefully. But her love for her people, her desire to be more than a mere figurehead, and the glint of possibility in Aldrich's eyes all beckoned her forward. She chose, then, to let herself believe in the promise of peace and love, even as the shadow of doubt settled into the recesses of her mind. Elara left the hall that day with a heart full of hope and the unshakable belief that her union with Aldrich would bring prosperity and joy. Little did she know that her trust and devotion would soon be shattered, her hopes dashed against the cruel rocks of betrayal. The stone corridors of Elara Castle were quiet that night, bathed in the silvery glow of the moon filtering through the tall, arched windows. Elara moved silently through the dim hallways, her gown brushing against the cold stone floor. The weight of the day's events hung heavily on her, an intoxicating mixture of hope, expectation, and a strange, lingering unease that gnawed at the edges of her happiness. As she walked, her mind wandered to the betrothal celebrations earlier, the dances, the vows, the radiant smiles of her people. Unable to sleep, she had slipped from her chambers in search of fresh air and solace beneath the stars. But as she neared the secluded wing of the castle reserved for royal guests, the muffled sound of voices stopped her in her tracks. She recognized Aldrich's voice immediately, its tone low and assured, yet carrying a note of something unrecognizable, something that made her heart skip a beat. She hadn't expected him to be awake at this hour, let alone conversing with such intensity. Curiosity rooted her to the spot. Aldrich's voice was joined by that of his most trusted advisor, Lord Varen, a shrewd and calculating man whom Elara had always found somewhat unsettling. She heard Varen speak, his words laced with a quiet urgency that contrasted with Aldrich's usual composed demeanor. "My lord," Varen whispered, his voice almost drowned by the stillness of the night, "the people of Elara adore her, and the king trusts her judgment. The princess is invaluable for our purpose, yet she cannot be allowed to interfere once we seize control." Elara's breath caught in her throat. Seize control? She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, straining to hear more, each word stabbing into her with increasing clarity. Her mind raced, each heartbeat a question, each breath a realization that the man she thought she was going to love was a stranger in truth. Aldrich's voice replied, calm and calculating, shattering the tenderness she had witnessed mere hours ago. "Do not underestimate me, Varen. The princess is blinded by her duty and sentiment. She will serve her purpose well enough until I ascend as her rightful king." He paused, as if considering the weight of his next words. "Once I have the throne, Elara will be no more than a faded memory in Aramore's history." The world shifted beneath her feet, her vision blurring as the truth crashed over her like a tempest. Each word fell upon her like hammer blows. The tenderness, the promises, the warmth of his hand in hers, all lies, crafted to ensnare her trust and pave his path to power. She felt a coldness settle into her bones, a chill deeper than the night air. Lord Varen continued, his tone as venomous as a snake's hiss. Then it settled. "Tomorrow we shall proceed with the final arrangements. Once you are wed and the alliance solidified, we will have unrestricted access to the kingdom's resources, its armies, its people. And the princess, unaware of her own complicity, will simply become a stepping stone to our greater conquest." For a fleeting moment, Elara's mind screamed at her to flee, to confront Aldrich in fury, to demand an explanation for this betrayal. But something within her, the part of her molded by years of watching her father govern, of understanding the weight of silence, held her back. She knew, with terrifying clarity, that if she revealed herself now, her life would be forfeit. She had to stay hidden, had to understand the full extent of the conspiracy that had woven itself into the very fabric of her future. Aldrich's voice softened slightly, as if to himself. "The people will mourn a little princess lost to history, but they will celebrate a strong king. This land needs unity, Varen, and it is I who will bring it, not her." The hollow words, devoid of the charm and warmth he had displayed, were enough to choke the last remnants of hope from her heart. It was not just betrayal. It was the calculated destruction of her dreams, her future, and her people's faith. The man she had thought she might love was nothing more than a tyrant waiting for his crown. Unable to bear another word, Elara pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle her ragged breathing. The corridor spun around her, and she felt as though she were drowning in a sea of cold darkness. Her vision swam as the realization set in, each thought like a jagged shard slicing through her soul. She knew now that everything she had believed was a cruel mirage, her heart ensnared in the web of a ruthless ambition she had never anticipated. The voices grew fainter as Aldrich and Varen moved further down the hallway, their echoing footsteps receding into silence. Only then did Elara release the breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her chest heaving with the agony of her discovery. She slumped against the wall, the stone unyielding and indifferent to her suffering. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow her whole, leaving her adrift in a chasm of despair and betrayal. Every kind word, every gentle touch, every vow whispered in her ear now rang hollow, leaving her feeling empty, her dreams shattered and lying in pieces around her. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding with a fury she had never felt before. And in that moment, Elara made a silent vow, a promise that she would see this betrayal avenged. Her love had been used, her trust discarded as though it were nothing. But if Aldrich believed that she would sit idly by, helpless in the face of his deception, he was gravely mistaken. With a new resolve kindling within her, Elara straightened, her gaze hardening as she looked out into the moonlit corridors. She was no longer the trusting princess who had dreamed of peace and unity. That Elara had been stripped away, replaced by someone colder, sharper, and infinitely more determined. The path before her was shrouded in shadows, uncertain and fraught with peril. But one thing was clear. She would not allow herself to be a pawn in Aldrich's twisted game. She would use his deception against him, turning his own plans into a trap that would bind him in his own web of lies. Tomorrow, she would stand beside him as the dutiful bride, her face a mask of serenity and loyalty. And yet, hidden beneath that mask, a storm brewed, dark and unrelenting. She would learn his every secret, uncover his every weakness. And when the time was right, she would strike, not as a queen betrayed, but as a force of vengeance that he would never see coming. Her heart ached, but the pain only strengthened her resolve. Aldrich may have intended to bind her to a life of obedience and silence, but he had instead awakened a fire that would consume him. Dawn broke across Aramor with a cold, unfeeling light that filtered through Elara's chamber window, casting a pale glow over her face. She hadn't slept. Her eyes, usually vibrant and filled with warmth, were rimmed with the hollow shadows of a sleepless night. Every moment replayed vividly in her mind. Aldrich's words, his callous plan, the cold certainty in his tone as he spoke of her fate like a pawn he would soon discard. She sat by the window, clutching the edges of her cloak around her shoulders, as if to ward off an invisible chill that clung to her soul. Her fingers tightened over the fabric, her heart a fortress of ice and fury. This was no longer a wound that could heal. It was a scar that would shape the woman she would become. The Elara who had dreamt of peace, who had dared to hope for love, was gone. In her place was a woman hardened by betrayal, her resolve forged anew like iron in fire. The sky outside was awash in muted colors, pale and haunting, as if even the heavens mourned the innocence she had lost. But Elara would shed no tears. She had cried her last for a man who had thought to rob her of her spirit. Now, her heart was set on a single purpose, clear and undeterred. Her gaze sharpened as she rose, crossing the room to stand before the mirror. She took in her reflection with an unwavering stare, as if trying to reconcile the woman who looked back at her with the one she had been only hours before. Her long hair framed her face, loose and wild, her eyes darkened with a resolve she had never known. Today was meant to be the dawn of a new life, a future with a husband by her side. But fate, it seemed, had a different path for her. Elara of Aramor, she murmured to her reflection, each word a quiet vow, you shall not falter. Turning from the mirror, she moved to a small, hidden drawer within her chamber and retrieved a slender dagger, its blade etched with the sigils of her ancestors. She had seen this weapon before many times. It was a ceremonial dagger, gifted by her father to mark her coming of age, a symbol of her role as protector of the realm. Until now, it had been a token, something she treasured for its craftsmanship, its history. Now it was a reminder that her loyalty, her duty, was not bound to a throne nor to a man, but to the people she served. She ran her fingers along the cold steel, feeling the weight of it, the promise it held. Her grip tightened as she considered her next move. She knew she could not rush headlong into a confrontation. Aldrich's power was vast, and his network extended like a dark web into every corner of the castle. She needed to play his game, to feign trust, to mask her anger with a smile. She would watch, listen, and gather every piece of his betrayal. And when the moment was right, she would turn the tables in a way he could never foresee. But first, she needed allies, and one name came to mind: Captain Torin. The exiled captain had once been one of the kingdom's finest soldiers, a man of unshakable integrity who had served her father until a betrayal by another noble had forced him into disgrace. She had always questioned the charges against him, sensing the injustice behind his fall. Now, she understood the machinations of those in power, and she knew that Torin's loyalty lay not with a title, but with honor itself. She needed his strength, his wisdom, and perhaps his anger, a fire that could match her own. Elara dressed swiftly, pulling on a dark cloak to obscure her features, moving silently through the hidden passageways of the castle, her every step carrying the weight of her newfound purpose. The corridors were empty, the morning air thick with the silence that often follows sorrow. She made her way to the stables, where Torin, now relegated to the fringes of the kingdom, kept a small, humble quarters as part of his sentence. Her arrival startled him, but he was quick to hide his surprise, his gaze narrowing as he took in her expression. "Your Highness," he said, his voice guarded. "What brings you here at this hour?" She looked at him steadily, meeting his gaze with a fierce determination that brooked no doubt. "Torin, I come not as a princess, but as one betrayed. I have learned truths that could topple this kingdom, and I seek an ally, one who understands the weight of honor." He studied her, the hardened lines of his face softening just enough for her to catch a glimpse of the man he once was, the loyal warrior who had fought for her father. There was a long silence between them before he nodded, his voice a whisper heavy with understanding. "What do you need of me?" She told him then in hushed tones of Aldrich's treachery, of the plans to seize her kingdom, to reduce her to a mere figurehead before casting her aside. Torin's eyes darkened as he listened, his fists clenching with anger, but he remained silent until she finished. When she looked up at him, her eyes a blend of sorrow and steel, he offered a single nod. "You are right to come to me, Your Highness," he said at last. "There are many who will not see past Aldrich's facade, who will take his honeyed words for truth. But I am not one of them." Elara felt a surge of gratitude, tempered only by the knowledge that this path would be treacherous, fraught with deception and danger. Yet, she felt the weight of her resolve settle firmly in her chest. She had found a kindred spirit in Torin, someone who would stand by her side, not out of obligation, but out of a shared commitment to justice. "We will need to be cautious," she murmured, glancing back toward the castle as if Aldrich's shadow lurked in every corner. "A single misstep, and he will know we are onto him. We must move quietly, gathering allies and understanding his plans from within." Torin's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, a silent promise of his loyalty. "Consider me yours, Princess. Whatever course you choose, I will follow. We will see this through to the end." Elara allowed herself a rare moment of relief, a flicker of hope that perhaps, even in the darkest night, she was not entirely alone. Together, she and Torin sketched the first steps of a plan, weaving a web of secrecy and strategy to counter Aldrich's treachery. They would bide their time, watch his every move, and when the time was right, strike with the force of all those who had been wronged by his deception. As they parted, she looked back at the captain, her voice steady and cold. "When the day comes, Aldrich will regret the day he dared to underestimate me." And so, she returned to her chambers, the weight of her dagger a comforting presence against her side. She no longer felt the despair of a princess who had lost her dreams, but the sharpened resolve of a warrior ready to reclaim her honor. For now, she would play the part Aldrich expected, a devoted bride, a trusting pawn. But beneath that facade, she was something else entirely, a storm gathering strength, waiting for the perfect moment to break free. Her vow was set, her path determined, and as dawn gave way to daylight, a new Elara emerged from the ashes of betrayal, a woman who would carve her own fate in defiance of those who sought to chain her. The days that followed Elara's pact with Captain Torin were filled with a delicate game of pretense and secrecy. She moved through the castle with the grace and poise expected of a future queen, her every gesture a carefully crafted illusion. Smiles adorned her face, soft laughter filled her voice, and her hand rested gently in Aldrich's during public appearances, creating the image of a bride blissfully awaiting her wedding day. Yet, beneath the layers of silk and the mask of serenity, her mind worked tirelessly, a tempest of plans and calculations. Every smile she shared with Aldrich now felt like poison on her lips, and each touch of his hand was a reminder of the betrayal that burned in her heart. She had to remind herself over and over that every lie she fed him was a step toward her vengeance, each feigned moment of affection an act of quiet defiance. Aldrich might see a princess under his control, but he was blind to the storm she was cultivating within. The hours she could steal away were spent in secret meetings with Torin, their discussions held in shadows and whispers. They met under the cover of night in hidden passages and abandoned chambers, a silent conspiracy against the man who sought to rob her of her throne and her life. Torin, ever vigilant, had come to understand the gravity of her plight, and his loyalty had shifted from mere duty to a fierce, personal resolve. Tonight, they met in the old library, a forgotten place cloaked in dust and quiet. The room's shelves rose high around them, stacked with volumes long since abandoned. The flicker of a single candle cast shadows across Torin's scarred face, deepening the sharp lines of his jaw, the fierce glint in his eyes. He was a man wronged by the kingdom he had served, and Elara knew that his resentment ran deep. But now, their grievances had intertwined, binding them in a shared pursuit of justice. Elara, Torin began, his voice a low murmur. We have many eyes on us. Aldrich's men linger in every corner, watching, listening. If we are to gather allies, we must be cunning. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. Then we start with those who bear grudges against him, those he has wronged and cast aside. We must approach them discreetly, ensuring their loyalty to our cause without arousing suspicion. Torin considered her words, his fingers drumming against the hilt of his sword. There are those within the ranks who remember my service before the disgrace, men who know the price of honor and would stand by a just ruler. But he hesitated, casting a wary glance around the darkened room. Loyalty comes at a high cost, princess. Many would follow you, but not all trust easily, especially with Aldrich's influence reaching far and wide. Elara's gaze sharpened, her voice edged with the steel of determination. I am willing to pay whatever price it takes. If Aldrich believes he can usurp my kingdom and bend my people to his will, he is gravely mistaken. Her words carried a weight that settled heavily in the silence between them. Torin looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring the depths of her resolve, before he spoke again. There is one man, he said slowly, a trusted officer by the name of Eric. He was once a close ally of mine, a soldier of unyielding integrity. Aldrich recently had him demoted, claiming he was insubordinate. I believe Eric's loyalty may lie with you, but it will take careful handling to bring him to our side. Elara's mind turned over the possibilities. She had heard of Eric, though only in passing, a man who had served with honor and dignity, respected by the soldiers who fought beside him. If they could secure his allegiance, others might follow, rippling through the ranks like a hidden current. Arrange a meeting, she instructed, her voice resolute. But ensure it is somewhere Aldrich's spies will not venture. I do not want even a whisper of this reaching him. Torin inclined his head, a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. Very well. I shall send word to Eric and arrange a discreet meeting near the Western Watchtower. Few guarded at night, and we can speak freely there. They exchanged a look of understanding, a silent pact between them, bound by the knowledge of what was at stake. Torin rose, his hand lingering on the hilt of his sword as he glanced back at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You are playing a dangerous game, Elara," he murmured. "A single misstep, and Aldrich will turn every one of his blades upon you." She met his gaze unflinching. "I am well aware of the risks, Torin, but I will not sit idle while a snake coils around my throne. He may think me defenseless, but he will soon learn that I am far more than he imagines." With a curt nod, Torin slipped away, vanishing into the shadows as swiftly as he had come. Elara waited a moment, her fingers brushing over the pages of a worn book on the table beside her, the weight of her plan settling heavily in her mind. She knew that the road ahead would be fraught with peril, that Aldrich's influence cast a long shadow, but her resolve was unwavering. Each step she took brought her closer to the reckoning she sought, a justice forged by the very hands he had sought to bind. The following evening, Elara slipped from her chambers once more, cloaked in darkness, as she made her way to the western watchtower. The air was thick with the scent of rain, the skies overhead heavy and ominous. She moved swiftly, her footsteps light against the damp stone, her heart a steady drumbeat that matched her resolve. When she reached the watchtower, she found Torin and Eric waiting in the shadows, their figures barely discernible against the darkness. Eric was a broad-shouldered man, his face etched with lines of weariness and determination. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, held a hint of suspicion as he regarded her. Yet there was respect there too, the kind born from witnessing strength in another. He inclined his head in a respectful nod, his voice a low rumble as he spoke. "Princess Elara, Captain Torin speaks highly of your resolve. I have heard whispers of what has transpired, and I am here because I believe in the honor this kingdom once held." She stepped closer, her gaze steady. "I will not ask for your loyalty in vain, Eric. The man who intends to take this throne is not only a threat to my life, but a danger to every value we hold dear. He would turn Eramor into a land ruled by fear, and I cannot allow that. Will you stand with me?" Eric considered her words, his gaze drifting from her face to Torin, then back again. There was a moment's silence, heavy and weighted, before he nodded, his expression resolute. "I have no love for Aldrich and his schemes. If you seek to reclaim this kingdom's honor, then I will fight beside you, Princess." Relief flooded through her, tempered by the knowledge that this was only the first step in a much larger battle. Yet, in that moment, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile spark amid the darkness that had enveloped her. With Eric's support, her plan had begun to take shape, a quiet rebellion gathering strength in the shadows. As the three of them laid out their strategy in hushed tones, she felt the weight of their shared purpose binding them together. They spoke of the men they could trust, those who had suffered under Aldrich's influence and might be willing to stand against him. She would need to act carefully, to gather her allies one by one, to build a foundation strong enough to withstand Aldrich's wrath when her deception was finally revealed. When their plans were set, Eric turned to her, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "You are braver than many would expect, Princess. Your father would be proud to see such strength in you." She met his gaze, a faint smile gracing her lips. "This kingdom was built on the sacrifices of those who came before us. If I am to lead, then I must be willing to fight for it, no matter the cost." And as they parted, her heart beat with a newfound sense of purpose, the fear that had once gripped her replaced by a fierce resolve. Her kingdom's future was a fragile thread, and she was its guardian, bound to protect it against those who would see it fall. She returned to her chambers under the cover of darkness, her thoughts racing as she considered the days ahead. There was a fire within her now, a flame that would burn until Aldrich's deceit was extinguished, until every lie he had spun lay unraveled at her feet. She would be the blade in the shadows, the silent force that would reclaim Eramor's honor, and neither doubt nor fear would sway her from her path. The days stretched onward, a quiet tension woven through each of Elara's movements, each smile she forced herself to wear in Aldrich's presence. She walked a delicate line, each interaction a test of her resolve as she played the role of dutiful bride while gathering secrets beneath the veil of obedience. Every night, hidden in the shadows of the castle's forgotten passages, she met with Torin and Eric, weaving a plan from fragments of trust, anger, and stolen whispers. But one evening, as Elara moved toward the secluded wing where she and her allies often met, she felt the unmistakable weight of eyes upon her. She paused, her pulse quickening, her senses sharpened. Her gaze swept the dim corridor, but she saw no one, only the shadows cast by the flickering torchlight. She forced herself to continue, her mind racing as she considered the possibility of being followed. When she reached the hidden chamber, Torin and Eric were already there, waiting in tense silence. She shut the door quietly behind her, breathing a sigh of relief as the tension in her shoulders eased, if only slightly. She could not afford to let her guard down. Not now, not when the web around Aldrich was tightening. Eric stepped forward, his face drawn and serious. "There's something you need to know, Princess. The conspiracy reaches further than we imagined." Elara's heart clenched, her worst fears solidifying into reality. She met his gaze, bracing herself. "Tell me." Torin and Eric exchanged a grim look before Eric spoke, his voice low and laced with disgust. "Some of the nobles you considered loyal are bound to Aldrich. They have been plotting this with him for longer than we knew. Wealth, power. He has promised them pieces of your kingdom in exchange for their allegiance. Even members of your own family." The word struck her like a blade to the chest, twisting and tearing through her resolve. Her family, her own blood. The betrayal spread deeper than she had anticipated, each revelation tightening a vice around her heart. She fought to steady herself, forcing her emotions into submission. "Who?" she asked, her voice a deadly whisper. Torin's gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "Your cousin, Lord Hadrian. He was once close to your father, but Aldrich's promises have turned him. He covets the lands near the northern border, where your family's estates have stood for generations. It seems he would trade honor for land and gold." Elara's chest tightened with a mixture of fury and sorrow. Hadrian had once been a brotherly figure, a steadfast presence from her childhood, a person she had trusted implicitly. But now, he was little more than a pawn in Aldrich's quest for domination, a reminder of how deeply ambition could rot the heart. She forced herself to breathe, to swallow the bitterness rising in her throat. "It will be a delicate game," Eric continued, his expression resolute. "We cannot confront Hadrian directly, not yet. He is well placed within the court, and his influence could expose us before we're ready. We must play along, bide our time, and strike only when we have all we need to unmask them." Elara nodded, feeling the weight of her role settle even more heavily upon her shoulders. Her kingdom, her people, her very blood had become entangled in Aldrich's treacherous scheme. And now, she realized, the fight was not only for her throne, but for the honor of those who had come before her, those who had believed in the legacy of Eramor. For a long moment, she stared into the shadows, her mind a whirlpool of anger and hurt. Her heart beat steadily, each pulse grounding her, strengthening her resolve. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, like steel wrapped in silk. "Then we shall give them no reason to suspect us. I will be the picture of loyalty, the perfect bride-to-be. Let them believe I am blind to their deceit." Torin's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a silent show of support that she welcomed with a faint nod. His voice, when he spoke, was edged with fierce loyalty. "They underestimate you, Elara. Aldrich may have his followers, his empty promises, but he does not understand what it means to fight for something greater than oneself. That will be his undoing." Eric, too, offered a look of quiet respect. "We stand with you, Princess. Whatever comes, know that our loyalty is unwavering." With her allies beside her, Elara felt the chill of betrayal melt, replaced by the steady warmth of purpose. She would play her part, weave herself into the fabric of Aldrich's plans as though she were the very thread binding them. She would laugh with him, speak words of love she did not feel, and allow him to believe he had won. And then, when he stood on the edge of victory, she would unravel him. The days that followed were a masterful dance of deception. In the great hall, Elara moved with grace and composure, her smile soft, her words filled with feigned affection as she charmed the courtiers and nobles, always keeping Aldrich close, under the guise of a devoted fiancé. Each day, she observed his moves, noting his interactions, piecing together the web of his power, the names of those who would stand by him when the time came. When she crossed paths with Hadrian in the halls, she felt the twist of bitterness in her heart, a sadness so deep it nearly swallowed her resolve. Yet, she spoke to him with warmth, allowing him to believe he was still cherished, a trusted member of her family. She bore the pain of his betrayal in silence, knowing that soon enough, the truth would expose him for the traitor he had become. At night, she met with Torin and Eric, and they mapped out each discovery, each name that Aldrich had bound to his side with promises of power and wealth. Nobles, generals, even a few members of the court clergy, each had been seduced by the lure of ambition, and each was a reminder of the rot that had spread beneath the kingdom's facade of peace. But in those dark hours, she also saw the glimmers of hope. There were those who stood with her, those who believed in her cause and had suffered under Aldrich's tyranny. Quietly, they pledged their allegiance, their loyalty a binding oath sealed in shadows, as they awaited the moment to rise against the false prince who dared to call himself their future king. And through it all, Elara held fast to her purpose, knowing that with each passing day, she moved closer to the reckoning that would shake the kingdom to its core. Aldrich believed he had her heart, that he had broken her spirit, but he was blinded by his arrogance, unable to see the fire that had been kindled by his betrayal. One evening, as she and Aldrich stood on the balcony overlooking the vast expanse of Eramor, he spoke softly, his tone filled with a false tenderness that made her stomach turn. "Our people will celebrate this union, Elara. Together, we will build a kingdom greater than any who came before us." She turned to him, her face a mask of gentle acceptance, hiding the fury that smoldered within her. "Yes, my lord," she murmured, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "We shall build something magnificent." He smiled, oblivious to the true meaning behind her words, and turned his attention back to the view. Elara's fingers tightened against the balcony's edge, her heart hammering with the anticipation of what lay ahead. Her path was clear now, her role defined. She was the blade in the shadows, the storm that would uproot his treachery and reclaim the honor that Aldrich had sought to tarnish. When she returned to her chambers that night, she felt the weight of her task settle around her like armor, a burden she carried with pride and determination. Her kingdom's legacy was at stake, and she would not falter. The web of conspiracy was vast, entangling those she had once trusted, but she would wield that same web as her weapon, turning each thread against Aldrich in a reckoning that would echo through the halls of Eramor for generations to come. The castle was alive with revelry, its grand halls adorned in finery, and the sound of laughter and music filled every corner. Elara moved through the celebration like a ghost, her heart untouched by the warmth and merriment surrounding her. She wore the guise of a bride, draped in silver and blue, her gown shimmering beneath the glow of countless candles, her veil like a whisper of mist trailing behind her. Each step she took was measured, her gaze calm and unwavering, yet her mind churned with thoughts of vengeance, her every sense heightened. Tonight was the night, the culmination of months of deceit and betrayal, of alliances forged in the shadows. As the courtiers and nobles toasted to her happiness and the promise of peace, Elara felt the weight of her role pressing down upon her, every movement calculated, every smile a lie. Aldrich's hand rested lightly at her waist, his touch a cruel reminder of the promises he had shattered. She could feel his gaze upon her, filled with pride and possession, as if he had already claimed her throne, her heart, her very soul. The hall was filled with faces she knew and faces she had come to distrust. Lord Hadrian was there, his eyes glinting with satisfaction as he raised his glass in a silent toast to her. Others who had pledged their loyalty to Aldrich watched with thinly veiled anticipation, each one a reminder of the treachery that had seeped into the foundation of her kingdom. She looked at them all, her expression serene, hiding the storm that brewed within her. They believed they had won, that she was bound to a fate of submission and obedience. But they knew nothing of the strength she carried, the resolve that had kept her steady as she unraveled their secrets one by one. As the night wore on, Elara endured Aldrich's whispers of affection, his hollow declarations of their future, each word feeding the fire of her resolve. She met his gaze, her smile soft, her voice gentle, all the while masking the contempt that simmered beneath. To any observer, she appeared the picture of a devoted bride, her hand resting lightly in his, her laughter mingling with his as if she were enchanted by his charm. And yet, beneath the mask, she was the wolf, hidden among the flock, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At the height of the evening, as the guests turned to toast the union, Elara excused herself, feigning the need for a moment's reprieve from the crowd. She slipped away from the hall, her gown trailing softly behind her as she moved through the quiet corridors, her heart pounding with anticipation. Every step felt like a beat in the rhythm of her vengeance, each turn a reminder of the task that lay before her. She knew the castle's every shadow, every passage, and she moved with the silence of someone who had spent years studying its secrets. Torin waited in the darkened corridor near the royal library, his face hidden in the shadows, yet his posture alert and ready. He looked up as she approached, his gaze flickering with a mixture of respect and resolve. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her expression hard. "Everything is prepared. Tonight, we reveal the truth." They exchanged a final look of understanding before she moved past him, her footsteps light as she continued on her path. Behind her, Torin melted back into the shadows, ready to play his part when the time came. She was not alone in this, she reminded herself. Her allies were scattered throughout the castle, each one waiting for the signal to act, each one bound to her by loyalty forged in the fires of betrayal. Elara reached the private chambers, where Aldrich had summoned her to meet him before the ceremony. A moment of intimacy arranged to further their facade of devotion. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself of her purpose, of the people she was fighting for, the kingdom she would reclaim. Her fingers brushed against the dagger concealed beneath her gown, a cold reminder of the truth she carried. The door creaked open and Aldrich stood waiting, his face alight with a smile that to any other might have seemed genuine. But to Elara, it was nothing more than a mask, as hollow as his promises. He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to pull her close, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Aldrich," she murmured, her voice soft, her gaze steady. "Before we continue with this night, there is something I must know." He raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in his eyes. "What is it, my love? Surely there is no question you cannot ask of me on this night." She forced herself to smile, a hint of vulnerability in her expression. "Do you truly mean all that you have promised me? The future you speak of, the peace you claim to desire for our kingdoms, is it real?" He laughed, the sound low and indulgent, his hand reaching out to brush her cheek. "Of course, my dear Elara. Our union will be one of legend. Together we shall rule, and all will remember the strength of our bond." Elara nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "Then let us seal this promise tonight," she whispered, her voice a delicate thread of challenge. Aldrich's eyes narrowed slightly, a glint of calculation flashing across his face. "And how would you wish to seal it?" She leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear, her voice barely more than a whisper. "With the truth. Tell me, Aldrich, if you love me as you claim, why have you gathered so many who would see my family dishonored? Why do you surround yourself with those who seek to betray my blood?" The question hung between them, a knife thrust into the silence, slicing through the veil of deceit he had woven so carefully. She felt his body stiffen, his hand faltering as he drew back, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker, more calculating. "Elara," he murmured, his voice hardening, "you speak in riddles. I have given you no reason to doubt me." She laughed then, a bitter sound that echoed through the chamber, her facade slipping away like smoke. "No reason," she repeated, her voice filled with scorn. "You would take my kingdom, my people, and bind me to a life of lies. Do not insult me by pretending otherwise." For a moment, Aldrich's expression faltered, surprise flashing in his eyes. But it was brief, a flicker quickly replaced by cold disdain. "So, you know? And what do you intend to do about it, princess? Your allies are few, your power weak. I hold the loyalty of those who matter." Elara's gaze sharpened, her voice steady and laced with the steel of her resolve. "Do you truly believe that loyalty bought with lies and greed will shield you from justice? Your empire of deceit will fall, Aldrich, and you will be remembered not as a king, but as a coward." He sneered, his hand tightening into a fist. "You think yourself strong, Elara, but you are nothing more than a pawn, a tool I used to claim what was rightfully mine. And now, you will either stand beside me willingly, or you will be cast aside like the others who dared to defy me." She stepped back, her hand slipping to the hilt of her dagger, her voice a calm, dangerous whisper. "I am no pawn, Aldrich, and tonight you will see the strength of Aramore's true heir." Before he could react, she drew the dagger, its blade gleaming in the candlelight, a weapon of retribution and honor. Aldrich's eyes widened, shock breaking through his mask of control, and he stumbled back, the first glint of fear shadowing his face. But Elara did not strike. Instead, she held the dagger aloft, her voice ringing clear as she spoke words meant not only for Aldrich, but for the spies who hid in the corners, the nobles who lurked nearby, waiting to witness the culmination of his scheme. "Tonight, the lies end," she declared, her voice filled with the weight of her lineage, her birthright. "Let all who seek to betray this kingdom know that I will fight for it, that I will defend it, no matter the cost." Aldrich glared, his face twisted in fury, but he was silent, his voice stripped away by the force of her words. Turning from him, Elara stepped back into the hall, her heart racing, her mind steeled. She had cast the first stone, struck the first blow in a battle that would echo through the walls of Aramore for generations. Her allies, her people, the kingdom she loved, all of them stood with her now, bound by the truth she had spoken. And as she walked into the night, she knew that this was only the beginning, the first act of a story that would end only when every thread of Aldrich's treachery lay unraveled, exposed to the light of justice. The great hall of Aramore was shrouded in silence, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows that danced across the cold stone walls. The celebration that had once filled the castle had faded into an eerie stillness, the joy and revelry replaced by an oppressive tension that hung thick in the air. Servants and nobles alike had retreated to the edges of the hall, their eyes wide and anxious as they watched the scene unfold, sensing that the night was far from over. Elara stood at the center of it all, her gaze steely, her chin raised as she surveyed those around her. At her side were Torin and Eric, their expressions grim yet unwavering, each one a silent pillar of support. Across from her, Aldrich's face was twisted with rage, his usual composure shattered, his eyes dark with barely restrained fury. The man who had once spoken to her of love and peace was gone, replaced by a stranger whose mask of charm had finally fallen, revealing the tyrant beneath. Aldrich took a step forward, his voice sharp and filled with venom. "You think this spectacle will change anything, Elara? You think your righteous words will turn these people against me?" His gaze swept the room, a scornful sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. "They stand with me. They know where true power lies." Elara met his sneer with a cold smile, her voice steady, resonant. "Do they? Then let us see who truly holds their loyalty." She turned, addressing the assembled nobles, the courtiers who had once toasted to her marriage, the guards who had bowed in feigned respect. "People of Aramor, I stand before you as your princess, the true heir to this throne. You have watched as this man, this pretender, sought to strip me of my birthright, to bind me in chains of deceit." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of uncertainty and fear. Elara's words struck deep, a reminder of the honor and legacy that the people of Aramor had held dear for generations. She took another step forward, her voice growing stronger, unwavering. "This man," she continued, pointing at Aldrich, "promised you peace, prosperity, a kingdom built on unity. But he lied. His promises were forged in greed, his ambitions steeped in betrayal. He sought not to unite us, but to rule through fear and domination. I ask you now, will you stand with a man who would destroy all we hold sacred, or will you stand with me for the kingdom that has been our home, our legacy?" A silence fell over the hall, and then, slowly, a single voice rang out, clear and bold. "I stand with the princess." It was a guard, one of Aric's men, his hand clenched over his chest in a gesture of loyalty. His declaration was followed by another, then another, until the hall echoed with the voices of those who pledged their fealty to Elara, their trust in her unwavering. Aldrich's face darkened, his hands clenched into fists. "Enough of this farce," he snarled, his voice filled with fury. He drew his sword, the blade gleaming coldly in the candlelight, a deadly glint of metal that promised violence. "If you will not submit willingly, then I will take what is mine by force." Torin and Eric stepped forward, their weapons drawn, their expressions hard and ready. But Elara raised a hand, stopping them. Her gaze remained fixed on Aldrich, her own hand moving to her side where her dagger was sheathed, the blade that had once been a symbol of her heritage, now a weapon of justice. "This is between us, Aldrich," she said, her voice quiet yet filled with an unbreakable resolve. "You sought to claim my throne, my people, my life. Now, you will answer for your crimes." Aldrich's sneer deepened, his eyes filled with contempt. "You are a fool, Elara. You are nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. And now you stand here, deluded, believing you can change the course of fate." Elara's expression hardened. "The only one deluded here is you. You thought you could take my kingdom, shatter my spirit. But you failed, Aldrich. You underestimated not just me, but the people of Aramor. And now you will pay for every lie, every betrayal." With a swift, fluid motion, she drew her dagger, its edge gleaming with purpose. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was as if the very air had frozen. She stepped forward, each movement graceful and precise, her gaze locked with Aldrich's, who matched her step for step, his own sword raised, his expression filled with a dark rage. Their weapons clashed, the sound echoing through the hall as steel met steel. Aldrich struck with brutal force, his attacks filled with fury, each swing a violent testament to his desperation. But Elara was swift, her movements controlled, her focus unyielding. She parried his blows with a skill honed through years of training, every motion calculated, a blend of strength and precision. Around them, the assembled crowd watched in tense silence, eyes wide as the princess fought for her kingdom, her honor. She felt the weight of their gaze, their hope and fear woven into every breath, and it fueled her, gave her the strength to stand her ground, to press forward with each strike. Aldrich's face contorted with frustration as he realized that his strength alone was not enough to overcome her. He lashed out with a wild, desperate swing, and Elara saw her opening. She ducked beneath his blade, stepping in close, her dagger flashing as she drove it toward his side, forcing him back with a pained gasp. "You thought me weak," she hissed, her voice a fierce whisper. "You thought I would break. But you were wrong." He staggered, clutching his side, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "This is not how it was meant to be," he snarled, his voice a desperate rasp. Elara's gaze was cold, unyielding. "No, Aldrich. This is exactly how it was meant to be. Justice. For my people. For Elara." In one final, decisive motion, she advanced, driving her dagger forward. Aldrich's sword clattered to the ground, his strength finally waning as he fell to his knees, the fight drained from his body. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, mercy." Elara's heart hardened, her voice a mere murmur. Mercy was something you never knew. She stepped back, watching as Aldrich crumpled to the ground, the weight of his ambition and deceit finally breaking him. A silence settled over the hall as she sheathed her dagger, her gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles and guards, each face filled with awe and newfound respect. And then, one by one, they began to kneel, heads bowed in reverence, a gesture of loyalty that resonated through the room. Torin and Eric stepped forward, their expressions filled with pride and relief, each one a testament to the journey they had shared, the battles fought in shadows and silence. Elara turned to them, her voice steady yet laced with an emotion she had not expected to feel, a fierce gratitude, tempered by the bittersweet knowledge of all they had lost along the way. "Tonight, we reclaim Elara, not through tyranny or fear, but through the honor that binds us, the legacy that has been ours since the beginning." The hall erupted in cheers, the sound reverberating through the castle walls, filling every corner with a triumphant echo. And as Elara stood amidst her people, their voices lifting her, she felt the weight of her kingdom's future settle upon her shoulders, a burden she carried with pride, a duty she would uphold with unwavering resolve. Her gaze turned to the windows, where the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, illuminating the castle with a warm, golden light. Elara was hers once more, reclaimed not through bloodshed alone, but through the unbreakable bond she shared with her people, the loyalty they had shown her in her darkest hour. And as the sun rose, she knew that her reign would be remembered, not as one forged in vengeance, but as a testament to the strength of a kingdom united, a legacy restored. As the echoes of celebration waned, and the first light of dawn broke over Elara, the great hall fell into a serene silence. The battle had ended, Aldrich lay defeated, his treachery unmasked for all to see, and the loyalty of the people restored to Elara. Yet, as she stood amidst the remnants of the confrontation, a profound sense of finality settled over her, heavy and bittersweet. The faces of her allies surrounded her, Torin, steadfast and true, his gaze filled with pride, and Eric, a soldier whose loyalty had never wavered. The nobles and guards who had once been swayed by Aldrich's lies now looked upon her with reverence, their heads bowed, their faith restored. For a moment, she felt a swell of relief, a triumph laced with gratitude that after all the betrayal and secrecy, Elara was once more hers. But even as they cheered her name, their voices rising in adulation, a quiet sorrow tugged at her heart. She had won her kingdom back, yet the path she had walked had changed her in ways she could not undo. The price of the throne had been steep, paid with pieces of herself that she had sacrificed along the way. Her innocence, her trust, her belief in love untainted by ambition. And in the reflection of the sun's golden light, she realized that Elara would forever be safe under her protection, but she could no longer rule it as she had once imagined. Turning to her people, she raised her hand, signaling for silence, her voice carrying a weight of wisdom born from hardship. "People of Elara," she began, her tone steady yet filled with emotion. "Today, we stand united once more, bound not by force, but by the honor and loyalty that has always been the heart of this kingdom. Together, we have overcome the darkness that sought to divide us, and together we shall rebuild." The crowd murmured in agreement, a sense of pride and unity pulsing through them, yet a hint of unease settled in her gaze. She could see the questions forming in their eyes, the expectation that she would lead them as queen, that her reign would mark a new chapter of peace and prosperity. But deep within her, She knew that her place was no longer on the throne, that her role as their protector demanded a sacrifice beyond what they could yet understand. Elara took a steadying breath, the weight of her decision pressing down upon her shoulders. She looked to Torin and Eric, her most loyal allies, the men who had stood by her through the darkest of nights, and offered them a faint smile. I reclaimed Eramor not for myself, but for each of you, for those who would protect our people with courage and honor. My duty was to restore the kingdom's legacy, to safeguard its future. And that future lies in the hands of those who understand the cost of power, those who would cherish it as a gift, not a prize. The hall fell silent, her words resonating with a quiet power, each one a testament to the journey she had endured. She looked upon the faces of her people, her heart swelling with both pride and a sorrowful resolve. "I will not sit upon this throne," she declared, her voice unwavering, "for my place is not in the light of day, but in the shadows that guard us. I shall be your protector, your silent watch, a shield that will ensure no tyrant ever threatens Eramor again." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd, confusion mingling with a sense of awe. Torin stepped forward, his brow furrowed in concern, his voice low but firm. "Elara, are you certain? After everything, this kingdom would be honored to have you as its queen." She met his gaze, a faint sadness lingering in her eyes. "I am certain, Torin. My path has been shaped by the fires of betrayal and vengeance, not by the purity needed to rule with a just heart. I have become something else, something Eramor needs, a protector who will always walk unseen, watching over this kingdom from afar." Torin's expression softened, understanding dawning in his eyes. He gave her a respectful nod, a silent acceptance of the burden she had chosen. Eric, too, stepped forward, his voice filled with reverence. "Then let it be known that Eramor has not lost a queen, but gained a guardian, a spirit that will guard this kingdom's soul." The crowd seemed to absorb her decision slowly, some faces marked by sorrow, others by a newfound respect. And though her heart ached at leaving behind the life she had once dreamed of, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that her sacrifice would secure the safety and honor of the people she loved. She would be the quiet force that ensured Eramor's legacy, a shadow that would protect them against threats they could never see. As the sun rose higher, Elara took a final look at the hall, her gaze lingering over the throne that had once symbolized her future. She knew it was a choice few would understand, yet she felt no regret, only a fierce pride that her kingdom would stand, even if she would not rule it. Turning to Torin and Eric, she nodded once, a silent farewell, her final act as Princess of Eramor. With the strength of her resolve guiding her steps, she moved through the hall, past the faces of those who would carry her memory, those who would whisper her name as a legend, a guardian of the realm who had sacrificed herself so that others could prosper. She left the castle that morning, her heart a blend of sorrow and pride, her path now shrouded in mystery. She would watch over Eramor from afar, her presence a quiet echo that would linger in the shadows, unseen yet felt. And as she vanished into the distant hills, the people of Eramor would remember her not as a queen, but as the princess who had given everything, even her claim to the throne, to safeguard their future. The kingdom endured, stronger than ever, its people united by the memory of the woman who had reclaimed its honor. And though she was gone, her spirit remained woven into the fabric of Eramor, a timeless guardian who would always be there, unseen, a silent protector of her people, forever bound to the land she had saved. Years passed since the fateful night when Elara chose to disappear into the shadows, leaving behind the throne to protect Eramor from a distance. Her legend grew as tales of the shadowed princess spread throughout the kingdom, whispered by firesides and in the quiet corners of bustling taverns. They spoke of a protector unseen, a guardian who would appear in moments of peril, a spirit as silent as the wind yet as fierce as a storm. Eramor flourished in those years, with Aldrich's betrayal rooted out and the nobles who had conspired with him brought to justice. the kingdom experienced a rare era of peace. The throne was taken by a council of wise advisors and leaders, allies Elara herself had chosen and trusted. They ruled with honor and integrity, carrying forward the legacy she had reclaimed. One cold winter's night, an old storyteller sat by the fire in the village square, his voice clear and firm as he recounted the tale of Princess Elara. His audience, young and old, watched in rapt attention, their faces lit by the flickering flames. "She is not gone, you know," he said, his eyes gleaming as he looked at the children at his feet. "The Princess Elara is still here, in the shadows, watching over us. When bandits strike, when tyrants rise, she is there, a silent blade, protecting us all. Some say they've seen her cloak under the moonlight, just a glimpse before she vanishes again." A young girl raised her hand, her eyes wide with wonder. "Will she ever come back to us?" The storyteller paused, a gentle smile touching his lips. "She never left, child. Her spirit is woven into every stone of this land, in every heartbeat of Eramor. As long as we remember her sacrifice, as long as we hold fast to honor, she will always be with us." In the stillness of the night, beneath the vast starry sky, a lone figure watched from the hills, cloaked in the darkness. Her face was hidden, but her eyes held a quiet pride as she looked down upon the kingdom she had saved. And as the firelight flickered below, casting her shadow over the land, Princess Elara turned, her silent vigil continuing, her legacy secured in the hearts of her people.